Have you ever heard of the ghost who walked through the Pacific jungles, invisible to the enemy, speaking a language the Japanese could never decode, and whose single bullet could change the fate of an entire battalion? What if I told you that the most lethal sniper of World War II was not who history remembers, but a man whose name was erased from every official record, whose kills were attributed to others, and whose existence was denied by the very government he saved? Before we begin this journey into one of the most classified stories of the war, I need you to do something for me. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. This channel depends on viewers like you to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. We're uncovering secrets that powerful people wanted buried forever, and we need your support to continue this mission. The first snowfall came early to Window Rock, Arizona, in 1941. It was December 7th, a Sunday morning that would split American history into before and after. Thomas Begay was 23 years old, herding sheep in the high country near the sacred Chuska Mountains when he heard his grandmother's voice carried on the wind. She was calling him home. He did not know why, but he ran. By the time he reached the small stone house where 3 generations of his family lived, the radio was crackling with news that seemed impossible. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. America was at war. Thomas stood in the doorway, his boots covered in red Arizona dust, listening to President Roosevelt's voice echo through the simple room. His grandfather, a man who had survived the long walk of 1864, when the United States Army forced the Navajo people on a 300-mile death march, sat motionless in his chair. His face was carved from years of suffering that Thomas could only imagine. When the broadcast ended, his grandfather spoke in Diné Bizad, the Navajo language. "The enemy of my enemy is not my friend, but perhaps in this darkness we can find light for our people." Thomas did not understand then what his grandfather meant. He would spend the next 4 years learning. By January of 1942, recruitment offices across the Southwest were flooded with young Navajo men eager to enlist. But Thomas did not join them. Not yet. He waited, watching, listening to the stories that filtered back from the first volunteers. They spoke of a special program, a secret project that needed men who could speak Diné Bizad fluently. The Marine Corps was recruiting Navajo speakers for something they called code talkers. Thomas enlisted in March. He was processed at Fort Defiance, given a serial number that he would remember for the rest of his life: 743921. During basic training at Camp Elliott near San Diego, California, he discovered he had a gift that set him apart from even the other code talkers. While his brothers in arms were learning to transmit messages in their native tongue, Thomas was being pulled aside for additional training. Someone had noticed that during marksmanship qualification, he had scored perfect on every single target at distances that made the instructors nervous. A gunnery sergeant named Murphy, a hard man from Boston with scars on his face that told stories he never shared, approached Thomas one evening after the others had returned to barracks. "Begay, you shoot like you've been doing this your whole life. Where did you learn?" Thomas thought of the high desert, of hunting mule deer with his grandfather's old rifle, of the patience required to wait for hours until the moment was perfect. He thought of how his grandfather had taught him to become part of the landscape, to breathe with the wind, to feel the earth's heartbeat through his feet. "My grandfather taught me that every bullet carries the spirit of the hunter. You must honor the bullet by making it true." Gunnery Sergeant Murphy looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Come with me. There's someone you need to meet." They walked across the darkened base to a building that Thomas had never entered before. Inside, 3 men in civilian clothes sat around a metal table covered with maps and photographs. One of them, a man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to calculate everything they saw, gestured for Thomas to sit. "Private Begay, I'm going to be direct with you. We've been watching you. Your marksmanship scores are the highest we've seen in this war. Combined with your language abilities, you represent a unique asset. We want to train you for specialized reconnaissance and elimination. Do you understand what that means?" Thomas understood. They wanted him to kill people. Not in the chaos of battle, but deliberately, surgically, one target at a time. "I understand." The silver-haired man slid a photograph across the table. It showed a Japanese officer standing on a beach, surrounded by soldiers. "This is Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto. He's responsible for coordinating the defense of Guadalcanal. He's brilliant, he's ruthless, and he's killed more of our boys than any other single commander in the Pacific. We need him removed from the board. But we can't get close enough. Every attempt we've made has failed. The jungle works for them, not for us." Thomas studied the photograph. The colonel's face was calm, confident. A man who believed himself untouchable. "When do I leave?" The training that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced. While the other code talkers learned communication protocols and radio procedures, Thomas was taught the art of invisible warfare. He learned to move through terrain without leaving a trace, to read wind patterns at distances of over 1,000 yards, to calculate bullet drop and drift using nothing but instinct and observation. He learned to survive on almost nothing, to remain motionless for days if necessary, to become a shadow that the enemy could feel but never see. His instructor was a Marine captain named James Thornton, a veteran of the Philippines campaign who had been pulled back for this special assignment. Thornton was a man of few words, but Thomas learned to read the subtle approval in his silence. "Most snipers think it's about the gun," Thornton said one day as they lay side by side on a hillside overlooking the Pacific. "But it's not. It's about patience. It's about becoming part of the world around you until you're indistinguishable from a rock or a tree. Your people understand this already. You've lived it for generations. That's why you're going to be better at this than anyone else." Thomas thought about his grandfather's teachings, about how the Daine had survived in a harsh land by learning to move with nature, not against it, about how visibility was sometimes the most dangerous thing you could possess. By June of 1942, Thomas Begay officially no longer existed. His name was removed from the Code Talkers roster. His records were sealed under classifications that would not be declassified for over 60 years. To the world, to his family, to everyone except a handful of men with security clearances higher than most generals, Private Thomas Begay had simply disappeared into the machinery of war. The man who arrived at Guadalcanal in August of 1942 was known only by a call sign, Ghost 37. The island was hell made manifest on Earth. The heat was suffocating, the humidity so thick you could drown in the air itself. The jungle was alive with creatures that bit and stung and infected. Malaria killed as many men as bullets. The Japanese held the high ground and fought with a fanaticism that terrified even the most hardened Marines. Every inch of ground cost blood. Thomas moved through this hell like smoke. While battalions clashed on the beaches and in the river valleys, he operated alone, sometimes miles behind enemy lines. His spotter was a Texan named Robert Hayes, a quiet man who had grown up hunting in the Big Bend country and understood the value of silence. Together, they became a legend that the Japanese soldiers began to whisper about around their fires. Shi no Kage, the shadow of death. The first target was not Colonel Yamamoto. The colonel was too well protected, too deeply entrenched. Thomas had to work his way through the layers of command structure, eliminating the men who made Yamamoto's defense possible. Artillery spotters who directed fire onto Marine positions, communications officers who coordinated movements, sergeants who rallied their troops when positions came under assault. Each kill was carefully planned, executed with precision that left no evidence except a body and a single entry wound. Thomas never took trophy shots. He never aimed for anything but center mass, or, when necessary, a clean headshot. His grandfather had taught him to respect life, even when taking it. Every bullet was a prayer, asking forgiveness for the necessity of death. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was devastating. Officers became paranoid, afraid to show themselves. Radio communications became chaotic as operators refused to transmit from the same location twice. Entire squads would retreat from positions they believed were compromised because someone heard a rumor about the ghost sniper. Intelligence reports that filtered back to Marine headquarters spoke of a supernatural killer, a spirit warrior who could not be seen or stopped. The Japanese began to believe that the Americans had enlisted the aid of demons. In September, after nearly 40 confirmed kills that were quietly attributed to various units across the island, Thomas was given the green light for the primary target. Colonel Yamamoto was scheduled to visit a forward observation post near the Mataniko River. The intelligence was solid, confirmed by 3 separate sources. Thomas and Hayes moved into position 72 hours before the scheduled visit. They found a position on a hillside overlooking the river valley, concealed by dense vegetation and partially collapsed volcanic rock that formed a natural hide. From there, Thomas had a clear line of sight to the observation post, a distance of approximately 940 yards. It was at the extreme edge of effective range for his Springfield rifle, modified with a custom scope that had been built specifically for long-distance shooting. For 3 days, they did not move. They barely breathed. Hayes would later describe it as the longest 72 hours of his life, lying in mud and insects, while Japanese patrols passed within meters of their position. Thomas never flinched, never showed the slightest sign of discomfort. He had entered a state of complete focus, his entire being concentrated on the single moment that was coming. On the 3rd day, September 23rd, Colonel Yamamoto arrived exactly as intelligence had predicted. He was surrounded by staff officers and guards, moving quickly through the observation post while reviewing maps and issuing orders. For anyone else, the shot would have been impossible. Too far, too many obstacles, wind conditions constantly shifting through the valley. Thomas waited. He controlled his breathing, feeling his heartbeat slow to a rhythm that matched the pulse of the earth beneath him. He calculated wind drift, temperature, barometric pressure, the slight upward angle of the shot. He became aware of every factor that could influence the bullet's path over the nearly 1,000-yard journey it would have to make. The colonel stopped, just for a moment. He paused to light a cigarette, turning slightly to shield the match from the breeze. In that instant, he was clear of his staff, standing in a small gap between 2 structures. Thomas squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the valley like thunder. Birds exploded from trees. Japanese soldiers dove for cover, frantically searching for the source of the shot. 940 yards away, Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto collapsed with a single bullet through his heart. He was dead before his body hit the ground. The chaos that followed was exactly what Thomas and Hayes had planned for. In the confusion, they slipped away from their position, moving through the jungle with the ease of shadows. By the time Japanese forces organized a search, the 2 Marines were already 3 miles away, melting into the terrain like they had never existed. The death of Colonel Yamamoto changed the course of the Guadalcanal campaign. Without his leadership, Japanese defensive positions began to collapse. Communication broke down. Supply lines that he had meticulously organized fell apart. Within weeks, the tide of battle had turned decisively in favor of American forces. Thomas Begay was never officially credited with the kill. In fact, the official military history states that Colonel Yamamoto died from artillery fire during a bombardment. This was intentional. The men running the Shadow War understood that Thomas's greatest weapon was not his rifle, but the psychological terror his anonymity created. If the enemy knew who he was, where he came from, they could prepare. But a ghost? A spirit that could strike anywhere, anytime? That was a weapon worth protecting. Between August of 1942 and December of 1943, Thomas operated across the Pacific Theater. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville, New Britain. He moved between islands like a whisper, always alone except for his spotter, always hunting the high-value targets that conventional forces could not reach. His confirmed kill count reached numbers that would not be matched by any American sniper until decades later. But those numbers existed only in files that would remain classified long after the war ended. Other code talkers would return home as heroes, their contribution to victory finally recognized, but Thomas could never be acknowledged. The nature of his service demanded eternal silence. He understood this. He had accepted it from the beginning. This was his war, fought in the shadows for a country that had once tried to erase his people's language and culture, a country that now desperately needed both. In the winter of 1943, something changed. Thomas began to notice inconsistencies in his targeting packages. Officers he was sent to eliminate turned out to be lower ranking than reported. Positions that intelligence claimed were critical were often barely defended. The photographs he received started to feel staged, too perfect, too convenient. He raised these concerns with his handlers during a rare trip back to base headquarters in New Caledonia. The silver-haired man who had first recruited him listened without expression, then told Thomas he was being reassigned. "There's a new target," the man said, sliding a folder across the desk. "This one is different. This one matters more than all the others combined." Thomas opened the folder and felt his blood turn to ice. The photograph inside showed not a Japanese officer, but an American. A Marine captain named William Hartley, stationed at a supply depot in the Solomon Islands. The dossier listed charges of treason, collaboration with enemy forces, and the systematic sabotage of American operations that had resulted in the deaths of over 200 Marines. "You want me to kill one of our own?" The silver-haired man's expression did not change. "Captain Hartley has been feeding intelligence to the Japanese for 8 months. He's responsible for the ambushes at Bloody Ridge, the coordinated attacks on Henderson Field, and the interception of supply convoys that cost us thousands of tons of equipment and ammunition. He's too well connected to prosecute through normal channels. His father is a senator. His brother-in-law is a Navy admiral. If this goes to trial, it becomes a political nightmare that could undermine the entire war effort. He needs to disappear, and it needs to look like enemy action." Thomas stared at the photograph. Captain Hartley had a kind face, the type of man who looked like he coached Little League and went to church on Sundays. He was smiling in the picture, standing next to what appeared to be his wife and 2 young children. "How certain are you about the intelligence?" "Certain enough to give you this order. The decision has already been made at levels far above both of us. You're being offered a choice, Begay. You can take this assignment, or you can be reassigned to regular infantry duty. But if you choose the latter, someone else will still complete the mission. The only difference is whether it's done by someone with your conscience or someone without one." Thomas thought about his grandfather, about the long walk, about all the times his people had been given impossible choices by men in positions of power. He thought about the concept of honor, about whether there was such a thing as a righteous kill, about the weight that every bullet carried. I'll do it, but I want to see the evidence myself. All of it. The silver-haired man nodded slowly, as if he had expected this response. You have 48 hours. Then you deploy. For 2 days, Thomas read through classified reports, intercepted communications, testimony from witnesses who had survived the attacks that Hartley allegedly facilitated. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. Hartley had been recruited by a Japanese intelligence officer before the war, a man he had met during peacetime deployments in Shanghai. The relationship had been cultivated carefully over years, and when war came, Hartley was already compromised. Money, ideology, or simple cowardice, the motivations did not matter. The result was the same. American boys were dying because of information he provided. But as Thomas read deeper, he began to notice something strange. The evidence was too perfect. Every piece of intelligence fit together too neatly. There were no contradictions, no ambiguities, no loose ends. In his experience, the truth was always messy. Real intelligence was fragmentary, contradictory, filled with gaps and uncertainties. This felt constructed, like a narrative designed to convince rather than inform. He raised his concerns again. This time, the silver-haired man was less patient. Your job is not to question orders, Private. Your job is to execute them. Do you understand the difference? Thomas understood. He also understood that he was being tested, that his obedience was more important to them than his skills. He nodded and said nothing more. The operation was scheduled for February 14, 1944. Valentine's Day. Thomas would remember that irony for the rest of his life. He and Hayes were inserted by submarine onto a small island where Captain Hartley was temporarily stationed, overseeing the transfer of supplies between depots. The plan was simple: a single shot from concealment during Hartley's morning inspection routine, make it look like a Japanese sniper had infiltrated the perimeter. They established position in a grove of palm trees overlooking the supply depot, a distance of approximately 600 yards. The shot would be straightforward by Thomas's standards, but as he settled into position, as he watched Captain Hartley through his scope, going about his duties with the efficiency of a competent officer, Thomas felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. Hartley did not act like a traitor. He did not show the nervousness, the furtive behavior, the subtle tells that guilty men always displayed. He moved with the confidence of someone with nothing to hide, someone who believed in what he was doing. He joked with his men, helped unload crates himself despite his rank, checked supply manifests with meticulous attention to detail. Hayes, lying beside Thomas, whispered what they were both thinking. Something's not right about this. Thomas had already come to the same conclusion, but orders were orders, and the consequences of disobedience in wartime were severe. He centered his crosshairs on Captain Hartley's chest and began the breathing sequence that preceded every shot. His finger moved to the trigger. 1 pound of pressure, 2 pounds, 3. A seabird cried out overhead. Captain Hartley looked up, shading his eyes against the morning sun. For just a moment, his face was visible in perfect clarity through Thomas's scope. And in that moment, Thomas saw something that made him freeze. Hartley's expression was not that of a traitor watching for enemy contacts or worried about discovery. It was the expression of a man who missed his family, who was tired and homesick, who wanted nothing more than to finish this war and go home to his children. Thomas released the pressure on the trigger. He could not do it. Not like this. Not without being certain. Hayes looked at him with wide eyes. Ghost, what are you doing? The window is closing. I need more time. Something is wrong with this whole thing. We don't have more time. Orders are to complete by 0800. That's 12 minutes from now. Then I'm disobeying orders. Because I'm not killing that man until I know for certain he deserves it. What happened in the next 48 hours would determine not just Thomas's fate, but expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American military intelligence. Thomas and Hayes went dark, disappearing into the jungle instead of returning to the extraction point. Using his code talker training and Navajo language skills, Thomas was able to access a secure radio frequency and contact a Marine intelligence officer he had worked with before, a major named Daniel Whitmore, who had always struck Thomas as one of the few honest men in the Shadow War. The conversation was brief and encrypted. Thomas explained his concerns about the Hartley assignment, the too perfect evidence, the feeling that he was being used as a weapon in someone else's game. There was a long silence on the other end of the radio. Then Major Whitmore's voice came back, tense and urgent. Stay hidden. Don't contact anyone else. I'm coming to you, but it's going to take 72 hours. If what I think is happening is actually happening, you and Hayes are in more danger from our side than from the Japanese. For 3 days, Thomas and Hayes lived like hunted animals in the jungle, avoiding American and Japanese patrols alike. They survived on rainwater and the few rations they carried, moving constantly to avoid detection. Hayes never questioned the decision, never suggested they should have just followed orders. The bond between sniper and spotter was absolute, built on trust that transcended rank or protocol. On the third night, Major Whitmore found them. He was alone, having traveled without official authorization, using a fishing boat crewed by Solomon Islanders loyal to the Allied cause. He looked like he had aged 10 years since Thomas had last seen him. Be gay. You just saved yourself from being executed for a crime you didn't commit. Captain Hartley is innocent. The entire case against him was fabricated by a group within military intelligence who are using this war to settle personal scores and consolidate power. Hartley's only crime was being too effective at his job and making enemies with the wrong people. They needed him gone, and they needed someone expendable to do it. Someone whose records were already buried so deep that when you disappeared after killing an American officer, there would be no questions asked, because officially, you don't exist. Thomas felt rage building in his chest, a fury colder and more dangerous than anything he had experienced in combat. They were going to make me murder an innocent man, then kill me to cover it up. Exactly. And they're not going to stop. There are at least 6 other operators like you scattered across the Pacific, all being used for similar operations. Political assassinations disguised as military necessity. The war has created perfect cover for eliminating anyone they consider inconvenient. Hayes spoke for the first time in hours. So, what do? We can't go back. They'll be waiting. Major Whitmore pulled out a map and several documents. I've been gathering evidence for months, but I needed confirmation. Thomas, everything you've done, every target you've eliminated, I need you to tell me how those assignments came to you. Who gave the orders? Who provided the intelligence? Who verified the targets? For hours, Thomas recounted his operations, describing in detail the process by which he received assignments. As he spoke, Major Whitmore's expression grew darker. By dawn, the picture was complete and absolutely damning. A cabal of intelligence officers, supply contractors, and politically connected military brass had created a shadow network within the Shadow War. They were using the classified sniper program not just to eliminate enemy targets, but to remove obstacles to their own interests. Officers who questioned supply contracts. Investigators who got too close to embezzlement operations. Even a few journalists who were asking inconvenient questions. The scale of it was breathtaking. Dozens of deaths, millions of dollars in stolen equipment and funds. Intelligence deliberately compromised to prolong the war and maximize profits from military contracts. All of it hidden behind classifications and operational security, protected by the very systems designed to keep legitimate secrets safe. "You realize what this means," Major Whitmore said quietly. "If we expose this, we're not just fighting a few corrupt officers. We're taking on a network that has infiltrated the highest levels of command. They have senators in their pocket, generals who owe them favors, journalists who will destroy our credibility. Even if we have proof, they have power." Thomas thought about his grandfather, about the long walk, about all the times his people had stood against impossible odds simply because standing was the right thing to do. Then we give them a choice. They can face justice quietly, or we can make this public and let everyone see what they've done. Even powerful men fear exposure. Over the next 6 months, operating from the shadows of the Shadow War, Thomas, Hayes, and Major Whitmore conducted a campaign unlike any in military history. They were no longer hunting enemy soldiers. They were hunting traitors within their own ranks. Using Thomas's skills, they gathered evidence, recorded conversations, photographed meetings that were never supposed to be documented. They built a case so comprehensive, so undeniable, that even the most corrupt officials could not ignore it. The network fought back. 3 attempts were made on Thomas's life, all of them thwarted by his training and instincts. An entire Marine platoon was sent to hunt them down under false pretenses, told that they were searching for deserters. But the Navajo grapevine, the code talkers who were still serving throughout the Pacific, helped Thomas stay one step ahead. Messages were passed in Diné Bizad over supposedly secure channels. Warnings were given. Safe houses were provided. The conspiracy began to collapse from within. Junior officers who had been coerced into participation saw a chance to save themselves and turned informant. Contractors who realized they were going to be scapegoated cut deals. The silver-haired man who had recruited Thomas disappeared one night from his quarters in Hawaii, never to be seen again. Rumors said he fled to South America with enough stolen money to live like a king. Other rumors said something much darker happened to him, something that involved a long-range rifle shot and a grave that would never be found. By August of 1944, the conspiracy was effectively destroyed. 17 officers faced courts-martial in proceedings so classified that the transcripts remain sealed even today. Dozens more accepted forced retirement in exchange for silence. The Shadow Sniper program was dissolved, its operators reassigned to regular combat units, or in Thomas's case, simply erased from all records. Captain William Hartley survived the war and returned home to his family, never knowing how close he had come to being murdered by his own side. The official story was that he had been the target of an assassination attempt by a Japanese infiltrator, an attempt that had been thwarted by alert sentries. Thomas Begay's war ended not with victory parades or medals, but with a quiet handshake from Major Whitmore on a beach in the Philippines as the sun rose over the Pacific. "You saved more American lives by not pulling that trigger than you did by pulling all the others. Remember that." Thomas returned to Window Rock, Arizona, in November of 1945, 7 months after the war in Europe ended and 3 months after Japan's surrender. To his family, To his community, he had simply been away serving somewhere in the Pacific with the code talkers. His actual service remained classified, buried under layers of security designations that would not be lifted until 2008, long after most of the people involved were dead. He never spoke of what he had done, what he had seen, what he had almost done. He married a woman named Sarah from the neighboring Zuni Pueblo, raised 4 children, worked as a school teacher on the reservation. He taught mathematics and history, instilling in young Navajo students the importance of education and critical thinking. He became a respected elder, known for his quiet wisdom and his ability to see through deception. But there were nights when Sarah would wake to find him sitting by the window, staring out at the desert darkness, his hands trembling slightly. On those nights, she would not ask questions. She would simply sit beside him, holding his hand until dawn came and the trembling stopped. In 1968, during the height of the Vietnam War, Thomas was visited by 2 men in dark suits who showed him credentials that identified them as belonging to an agency that did not officially exist. They wanted to recruit him to train a new generation of snipers, to pass on his knowledge and skills. Thomas listened politely, then told them no. When they pressed, asking why he would deny his country his expertise, he gave them an answer that ended the conversation. I did not fight to protect a system that uses young men as disposable tools for corrupt men's ambitions. I fought to protect the idea that America could be better than that. Until you prove to me that the system has changed, that men like those I exposed are no longer in power, I will not help you create more ghosts. The men left and never returned. Thomas never knew if his words made any difference, if anyone in power heard them or cared. But he had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. In 2001, at the age of 83, Thomas Begay was finally acknowledged for his service during World War II as part of a general recognition of Navajo code talkers' contributions. He attended the ceremony in Washington, stood on stage while a medal was pinned to his chest, and smiled for photographs with the president. None of the official citations mentioned his actual role, his confirmed kills, his exposure of the conspiracy within military intelligence. Those details remained classified. During the reception afterward, a young Marine approached him. The Marine was Navajo, from Shiprock, and his eyes held the same intensity that Thomas remembered from his own youth. The young man saluted crisply, then spoke in Diné Bizad. "Grandfather, I have heard stories about you, stories that are whispered among the code talkers who are still alive. They say you were the greatest sniper in the Pacific Theater. They say you saved hundreds of lives by choosing not to fire a single shot. They say you are proof that the greatest warrior is not the one who kills the most enemies, but the one who knows when killing is not the answer." Thomas looked at this young Marine and saw himself decades earlier, filled with purpose and certainty, believing that right and wrong were simple concepts that could be aimed at and eliminated from distance. He put his hand on the young man's shoulder. "The greatest lesson I learned in the war was that every bullet carries a weight that never goes away. You can justify each one, you can tell yourself they were necessary, but they never leave you. The shots you fire become part of who you are. But the shot I did not fire, the trigger I did not pull when ordered to, that is what saved my soul. Remember that when your time comes to choose." Thomas Begay died in his sleep on December 7, 2012, exactly 71 years after Pearl Harbor brought America into the war that would define his life. He was 94 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including the last surviving members of the original Code Talker program and several high-ranking military officials whose presence was never explained to the family. In his personal effects, his children found a small wooden box that he had kept locked for decades. Inside were photographs, documents, and a journal written in Diné Bizad. The journal detailed his service during the war, including operations and information that were still technically classified. His oldest son, a lawyer, faced a difficult decision: make the journal public and risk prosecution, or burn it as his father had requested in his will if certain conditions were not met. The conditions were simple. If the government had declassified the Shadow Sniper program and acknowledged its abuses, the journal should be donated to the National Archives. If not, it should be burned. In 2013, the Sun checked with military historians and freedom of information advocates. The program remained classified. The abuses had never been officially acknowledged. Following his father's instructions, he burned the journal in a ceremony attended by the entire family. But before he burned it, he read it. And what he read changed him in ways he never fully explained to anyone. He left his law practice 6 months later and began working for indigenous rights organizations, fighting against government overreach and corporate exploitation of Native American lands. When people asked what prompted the career change, he would only say that his father had taught him the importance of standing against injustice, even when the cost was high. The official records still list Thomas Begay as a code talker who served with distinction in the Pacific Theater during World War II. His confirmed kills, his role in exposing military corruption, his shadow war within the shadow war, all of it remains buried in files that may never be declassified. The young Marines who train as snipers today at bases across America do not know his name. The history books do not mention his existence beyond a footnote in the Code Talker program. But among the Navajo people, among the families of the Code Talkers, the story is told differently. They speak of a man who was given the power to kill from a distance, but chose to use that power with wisdom and restraint. They speak of a warrior who understood that true courage is not found in pulling the trigger, but in having the strength to resist when pulling that trigger would be wrong. They speak of Thomas Begay not as the greatest sniper of World War II, but as the greatest example of what a warrior should be. And late at night, on the reservation, when the wind blows across the high desert and carries with it the whispers of ancestors and the weight of history, old men will tell young boys a story. They will speak of the ghost who walked through the Pacific jungles, invisible to enemies, speaking a language that could not be broken, carrying a rifle that never missed. They will speak of the moment when that ghost became human again, when he chose mercy over obedience, truth over expedience, conscience over command. They will speak of the choice that defines us all. Not the evil we prevent, but the evil we refuse to commit, even when ordered to do so by those in power. Some say that Thomas Begay's spirit still walks the desert at night, watching over his people, protecting them from threats both foreign and domestic. Others say that on certain mornings, when the light hits the mountains just right, you can see a figure standing on the high ridges, patient and still, waiting for a shot that will never come, because the target has learned to be better than it was. The truth, as always, is both simpler and more complicated than legend allows. Thomas Begay was a man who did terrible things in service of a righteous cause, who discovered that righteousness itself can be corrupted, and who made the hardest choice a soldier can make. He chose to be human in a system designed to make him a weapon. He chose to think in a hierarchy that demanded obedience. He chose to save a life when killing would have been easier. History may never officially record what he did. The files may remain sealed until everyone who knew the truth has passed into memory. But the lesson remains, passed down through stories and whispers, through the quiet teachings of grandfathers to their grandsons. The greatest warrior is not the one who never misses. It is the one who knows when not to shoot at all. And that knowledge, that wisdom, that courage to stand against the darkness even when it wears the uniform of authority, that is the true victory. That is what Thomas Begay won in the jungles of the Pacific 70 years ago. Not a war, not even a battle, but his soul. In this world of confusion and darkness, where young men are still sent to fight wars that serve interests they do not understand, where power still corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, there is only one certainty that can guide us through the chaos. Turn to God. Turn to Jesus Christ. Not as a political statement or cultural obligation, but as a genuine search for truth and redemption. Thomas Begay understood this in his final years. The weight of what he had done, justified or not, necessary or not, could only be carried with faith. The darkness he had walked through could only be navigated with light. If you are watching this and you feel lost, if you have done things that haunt you, if you carry weight that no one else can see, know that redemption is possible. Know that God's mercy is greater than any sin, that Christ's sacrifice covers even the darkest deeds done in the shadow of war. Thomas found peace in his faith, in his family, in his service to his community. You can find it too. The story of the greatest Navajo sniper of World War II is not a story about killing. It is a story about choosing life. It is a story about having the courage to disobey when obedience would mean becoming a murderer. It is a story about one man who was given the power to be invisible and chose instead to be seen, to be accountable, to be human. And somewhere, in files that are still classified, in records that may never be opened, the truth waits. The full story of Thomas Begay, Ghost 3-7, the shadow who became a man, the weapon who chose to be a witness instead. History may never tell his story completely, but his legacy lives on in every person who chooses conscience over command, truth over convenience, humanity over orders. That is the lesson. That is what we must carry forward. In a world that demands we become tools, we must insist on remaining human. In a system that wants warriors without questions, we must be warriors with wisdom. And in the darkness that comes for us all eventually, we must hold on to the light that no classification can bury, no order can extinguish, no power can take away. The ghost walked through the jungle, but the man walked home. Remember that. Remember him. Remember what he chose, and why it matters more than any number of confirmed kills or classified operations ever could. Remember that the greatest victory in war is sometimes the battle you refuse to fight, the trigger you do not pull, the order you do not follow. Remember Thomas Begay. Remember the choice. And when your moment comes, when you face the impossible decision between what is ordered and what is right, remember that you are not alone. Generations of warriors who made the hard choice stand with you. God stands with you. The truth stands with you. And sometimes, that is enough.